I was browsing YouTube and saw this video by Plant Chompers. A commenter previously asked me to do a video on Plant Chompers, so I decided what the hey. Let's check it out and see some good old-fashioned debunking.
It told me that millions of men would flock to a 3-hour interview with biochemical lingo.
And there are other molecules like this that are also found in these type of foods, the brassicate family of foods. Things like goitrin or allyl isothiocyanate. They're all isothiocyanates.
And would shun real scientists who have simple charts and compelling data.
But we're looking at a range of protein concentrations in the food to see what happens.
I would have thought you were trolling me. But one thing I have learned is that if you can craft a good story around meat and butter being healthy, even if you have no science, you can get some serious traction.
I think there are a lot of people who are looking for changes in their diet, mainly because the things they've been told thus far haven't actually proven themselves to work when people put them into practice. So hearing something radical is likely to turn some heads. And when the forum is a big YouTuber with millions of subscribers, we can see how it's not a stretch of the imagination that it got so many views. There are a number of reasons why diets fail. A lot of what I've come to know about the carnivore diet is from people who tried veganism in earnest, who had their hands forced. Health failure was the trump card. It's also fairly new in terms of our history and almost guarantees that it'll make a person skinny, so it stands to reason why humans, who are nothing if not dangerously superficial, would flock to it and try it.
Several friends asked me about the carnivore diet episode on Joe Rogan's podcast that featured Paul Saladino. Here's the thing, Paul looks like he could be Will Bolshewitz's brother. Both are good-looking 40-something doctors with great physiques who publish best-selling books with completely opposing messages. Will is all about plant-heavy diets like the Mediterranean or whole-plant vegan, whereas Paul is all meat all the time. How's a consumer with no scientific or medical background to figure out who got it right? Both are great guys who believe they're on missions to improve the world. But their messages are so opposite, there's no room for both to be right. Or is the answer no one knows, so just eat to feel good?
I'm glad he acknowledges just how hard it can be for a layperson to navigate the murky water that is fad diets and nutrition science. That's partly what this channel is about. I really don't care who is spearheading a movement. I care about results. However, this is the first time I've heard of Will, so let's see what we can find. He is apparently a gastroenterologist. Some sources say he is a vegan, others that his family follows a plant-based diet. Whose family doesn't these days? If he's a vegan, he's already lost me. It means he's taking vitamins and no thank you. As for the food, a year ago, you would have found me very interested in the lineup. Oatmeal, fruits, fresh vegetables, sweet potato, nuts. But now, I can't help but look at this and see sugar on top of sugar, meaning I'm going to crash at some point after eating, and raw vegetables and cooked beans, both of which are going to have me so bloated and gassy that I won't want to get out of bed. I see no nutrition.
Paul got 10 times the views on YouTube in his interview with Joe Rogan than Will did in his interview with Rich Roll. But I think I can show very simply without confusing biochemistry that Will has 10x the credible science on his side.
I don't know what this guy's deal is, but he doesn't do what he said he was going to do by the end of the video. Just a heads up.
Bold claim. Let's go. Joe and Paul opened with this idea.
As a talking point that I actually stole from you, is that most plants are inedible, but almost all animals are edible.
That's true, and not just for humans, but for any plant-eating animal like a cow, a horse, or a monkey. Does that mean they're better off eating meat? That experiment has been done carefully and published perhaps 1,000 times on various animals like rabbits and pigeons and monkeys and pigs, you name it. It doesn't take much for their arteries to close up like it did with these monkeys, which became totally blocked when 40% of their calories in this case came from egg yolks. Once they went back to eating predominantly plants, their arteries opened back up like this. That only works for herbivores and omnivores. You can't give a lion heart disease with meat. But guess whose arteries clog up if you give them a fair amount of meat? Humans! Clogged arteries are the leading cause of death in America. And now we know from doing MRI scans on prehistoric humans, those that ate much meat got it too. Here's Otzi the Iceman from 5,300 years ago, who had wild ibex meat in his stomach and had very advanced heart disease. Same with Inuits, who lived 500 years ago in Greenland.
I think it's very cute that he picks out specimens from less than 6,000 years ago. The number I often see for the advent of agriculture is 10,000 years ago. If the theory is that it's a combination of plant material and animal products that is the problem, namely high carb and high fat, then it stands to reason that these early humans would have suffered for such a diet. The question remains, Would they have suffered less if they always only ate meat?
I remember there was a story about a guy in a nursing home, and he had went out and picked mushrooms for the people in the nursing home and cooked them up, and they all died.
Are we really going to focus on death by mushroom in the middle of a pandemic that's killed 1.5 million people so far? It's not the plants that send out viruses to get us. It's the animals we raise to eat. The overwhelming incidence of food poisoning that emergency room doctors see comes from bacteria like Salmonella, which originates in animals.
I'm of the opinion that so long as we share the earth with animals, we will always be susceptible to poisonings. You don't even have to eat them. You can just drink the water they've pissed in, or eat fruit that touched ground that they pooped on.
So I think that's -5 science points for Paul and Joe for insane logic with no data.
I told you he was clowning.
The premise of the Carnivore Code is returning to our ancestral diet. It's on the cover of the book, and the early part of the book is devoted to it. Quite fascinating. Here's the thing. People who devote their lives to studying the evolution of man say the idea of a paleo diet is a myth. People ate completely different diets depending on where they lived, just as modern humans do today. Aborigines, like most ancient humans, dug up a lot of fibrous roots to eat.
The digging stick has been used by Australian Aborigines for thousands of years. It was of particular importance to Aboriginal women, as it was their primary means of digging up roots and tubers, which was the mainstay of their diet.
Okay, so are we talking millions of years or thousands? Because I feel like this guy is conflating the two. I don't doubt that people ate whatever they could find. I don't doubt that the inclusion of some root plants can help people survive in times when meat is scarce. Humans are incredibly resilient, but we can't maintain these states forever. I want to know the likelihood of a human surviving on an all-meat diet versus a diet with all plants and no supplements, because they didn't have those back then, so they can't count. A mixed diet seems problematic from both of these points of view, but that's the kicker for me. I shouldn't have to rely on pharmaceuticals if the diet is healthy or good for me, plain and simple.
What separates the carnivore diet from every meat-heavy diet before it is Paul's belief that any amount of plants is toxic to humans.
I don't know about that. I can't know. Most of what most of us can do is judge things based on our history and our personal experience. So, if Paul eats plants and feels like death, it's small wonder why he looked into it. If Paul sees that all of the plants he was eating contains toxins and are trying to kill the thing that eats it, there's good reason for that, it's true. If Paul also sees that combining sugar and fat is super problematic and decides to eat copious amounts of sugar and fat anyway, making it clear that for him, like almost everyone else on Earth, health takes a backseat to his sugar addiction, that's his prerogative. It's his life and his body to experiment with. The rest of us are also experimenting. I demonize sugar because it seems to be the reason for failing health overall. I prioritize animal products because they provide the most nutrition in a way the body can readily receive. I don't need Surfer Man's amen to back me up, and neither do you need Willie the gastroenterologist to back you up. If you eat plants and you feel well, more power to you. I feel like crap when I do, so I avoid them, and I feel much better now that I'm eating what is becoming increasingly clear to me is real human food.
I'm trying to show respect, but let me read you a passage from his book and let you judge for yourself. As an aside, the whole premise that molecules that independently evolved in plants would somehow be beneficial in humans sounds a bit far-fetched to me. It would be highly unlikely for one molecule, let alone thousands of molecules produced during plant evolution, to truly be beneficial in humans after our evolutionary path diverged from theirs 1.5 billion years ago when we were little more than a single-celled blob. Imagine the odds against this! Exclamation point. I'm sorry for facepalming, but he really wrote that. Honestly, I think most high school biology teachers would give -10 science points for that, because coevolution of plants and animals is key to the world's ecosystems. Charles Darwin wrote about that in 1859 in Origin of Species. This is why I recommend listening to actual evolutionary biologists, not Paul.
Yeah, and when I listen to people who study this stuff, I fully understand the relationship between, say, the earth, ruminants, and humans. Something that plant-based people often try to pretend is not a thing for some reason. Oh, that's right. Agenda.
And that brings up epidemiology, a field of science most of us revere when it comes to infectious diseases like COVID-19 and tracing its spread. Epidemiology is what helped us unravel the health effects of smoking. This is where Will has a huge advantage because he got a master's degree in epidemiology on his way to med school and has co-authored 21 scientific papers, plus 10 science points for Will.
This dude is straight up clowning.
If you trust epidemiology, which Joe and Paul don't and Will does, then you believe the world's healthiest people eat plant-dominated diets.
I understand that there is only so far that such research can take us. It falls short of being definitive, though. When it comes to nutrition, the most we have are educated guesses. Once people decided to undertake the experiment, we started to see the impact. People went vegan, many of them trusting this science. It looks good on paper, it had so many subjects, it was peer-reviewed, it's backed by major organizations. You can't blame them for believing it. So they tried, but they failed. And why is that? Why would that be? They didn't want it enough? They didn't take the right supplements? They couldn't deal with feeling like crap 24/7 and wanted to feel good again? Subsequently, there are some accusations of the meat, dairy, and egg industries. So, some classic pot calling the kettle black action. Information that is completely useless as it has nothing to do with results, and the plant-based side suffers from the same problem. I want to know the actual results, and from there, I'll make my decision on what to do with my diet.
Why do I mention epidemiology? Because it's long-term. Even if you smoke, it probably takes 20 years to have major impact. Paul has been on the carnivore diet for 2 years. He came to it as a psychiatrist who listened to the Joe Rogan interview with Jordan Peterson, a psychologist. How many times have clinical trials indicated the short-term safety of things like artificial sweeteners, only to find out 20 years later they weren't safe at all?
Right, so results. We couldn't have known until we tried it. Who doesn't get that? It looked fine on paper, it passed some tests, now move it to mainstream and sink or swim. Also, he criticizes Paul for touting the diet after trying it for such a short period of time. What of the vegan diet? What of a plant-based diet? This is a novel idea. In the past, if people would abstain from eating animal products, what are the odds that it wasn't for the lack of them or for some weird religious reason? Not because they thought it was healthy, not because it was proven healthy. It's likely they didn't have a choice, and modern science tells us it's not sustainable without supplementation anyway. None of this is true for meat. What humans ever were like, we ran out of plants, so let's have some fish? So I look at what is the constant, the inclusion of at least some animal products. And there are places on Earth where it's sometimes only animal products or very little plant matter. Nothing about that seems new or experimental in the slightest.
But blood tests are a good short-term snapshot of health. So a great question is, what are the blood tests of carnivores? What's Paul's?
What would happen if you went to a cardiologist?
They would fall out of their chair when they saw my lipids. They would say
How
that
bad is it?
my most recent LDL was very high. It was 533 milligrams per deciliter.
I went to the Mayo Clinic's heart attack risk calculator and tried to input Paul's numbers. It's based on an enormous database we have accumulated in America of risk factors. It even asks how many servings of fruit and vegetables you eat because the data shows that reduces risk, and how many servings of meat because the data shows that increases it. It also wants to know your blood pressure, weight, how much you exercise, and whether you've ever smoked. But Paul's number blew up the calculator because it wouldn't take total cholesterol higher than 350, and his is nearly twice that. So I looked for other carnivore blood tests. Here's a 28-day challenge where Joe, a 9-month high-meat eater, went vegan for 28 days, and Chase, a 10-year vegan, went high-meat for 28. 4 doctors who are on various diets themselves commented on the blood work where the key numbers went like this. LDL cholesterol in the vegan more than doubled to the high-risk category, and the high-meat eaters dropped in half to the low-risk category. Insulin dropped while eating vegan and increased while eating carnivore. IGF-1, which is linked to a risk of cancer, dropped while eating vegan and increased while eating carnivore. C-reactive protein, which is a measure of inflammation, dropped dramatically when the carnivore went to vegan, although that number bounces around a little bit. It's high after you run a half marathon, for example.
So are we okay with taking the short-term results, or are we not? Because Chris seems to want to have his cake and eat it too. Who's to say how different things would be for Paul, or the people he mentioned in the experiment, if we waited 10 or 20 years? Maybe by the time Paul dies, or Willie, the gastroenterologist, dies, something previously unknown can be made clear. We can't know until we come out at the end. In the meantime, you do what you think is best for you, but kindly keep your ideology out of it when you're trying to get other people to hear you out. He goes on to try to discredit Paul by comparing his Joe Rogan interview to other videos people could watch that have received less attention, and comparing him to people who science in ways that he doesn't science. It's basically researchers who point to bad health outcomes, but without pinpointing the cause in the clips shown, which is basically useless information. It's no secret that people are dying of so-called modern diseases. It's the price we pay for living modern lives and eating modern food. If the argument is we have to eat and feel like crap because first world country in 2003, that doesn't appear to be what Paul is getting at or wants for himself. So long as he lives an active life away from modern cities, maybe that will have a positive impact on his health overall, his high LDL be damned. And that doesn't mean that certain foods are bad for us generally, or that certain health outcomes are bad for us generally, if a change of pace resolves the problem.
But Chris, how about just eating till you feel good? Isn't that the ultimate in common sense? Paul and Joe mentioned that a lot. This is where I have to give plus 10 science points to Will, who makes his living looking inside you with a colonoscope. How many people do we know who looked and felt fantastic just before getting a heart attack, ulcerative colitis, or colon cancer?
For example, in a patient just this past week, I had a patient who was 50, and I found a huge polyp. So his colonoscopy saved his life, because if he never had a colonoscopy, he would have had colon cancer.
And what does he say about risk factors for colon cancer?
Every 10 grams of fiber that you consume gives you 8 to 10% reduced risk of developing colorectal cancer. That doesn't mean, unfortunately, that you can eat 100 grams of fiber and reduce your risk to 0. But what it does mean is that a high fiber diet is to our benefit. And here we are in the United States, and the average person is only getting 15 grams of fiber per day, which is minuscule. It's nothing.
I don't know enough about this guy to say anything other than he seems like he has his heart in the right place. However, there's a lingering question in my mind that I think it's hard for any scientist or researcher to get over, and that is, what would it truly be like for people if they went full carny? There is no sugar messing anything up, no plants messing things up. Just straight energy and nutrition from a natural source with no weird supplements or chemicals, barring maybe some salt, some electrolytes. How would it be bad for you? How could it be bad for you? How can we be sure it's not just bad because of the presence of sugar or plants? We already know a plant-based diet is unreasonable because it's unsustainable without supplements, and many of these supplements fail to meet the same standard as meat. I suppose the trade-off is that you have to consume a lot of fat, but why is fat bad again? It is energy, and it allows our bodies to perform like well-oiled machines. Are we worried about modern diseases? Without the influence of dietary carbs and plants, I fail to see how fat becomes problematic.
Finally, I know some of you wonder about the planet, and Paul is well known for headlines like this. You know, as someone who has spent 16 years as an earth scientist, I feel pretty confident in saying I think this spry 93-year-old is a better authority to listen to.
Whenever we choose a piece of meat, we too are unwittingly demanding a huge expanse of space.
The planet can't support billions of large meat eaters.
That was a really hard episode for me.
I literally laughed out loud when it cut back to Chris when I watched this the first time. Was that really it? Okay. So I guess Chris doesn't really think that humans should be concerned with what is actually healthy because environment? My point of view is, start with what's healthy and find ways to make it work. I'm so not convinced that we can't make it work because some old guy said so. You're the earth science guy. That's how you science. And not only did you defer to someone else, you inserted the most meaningless clip of all time to literally not pick up any of the slack.
So much science denial on topics that matter so much, it's hard on the soul. But the good news is the science is really clear that eating a plant-predominant diet is the best thing we could do for our health and the planet. I hope this was helpful, and thanks so much for watching.
Honestly, I can't. I really can't. I can't take a person seriously who sits here and touts that this diet is healthy, and yet doesn't mention the most important thing. It is so unhealthy and so deficient that it requires supplementation in order for us to maintain, and even then, a large number of people who try have to stop because they feel awful. And this is what it boils down to. Chris belittles caring about how it makes you feel. Why pretend you can't understand that how something makes you feel plays a huge role in whether or not it's feasible or practical or practicable or reasonable or sustainable? It's important for us to understand why they fail. If their bodies are shutting down, it means it doesn't work. If it doesn't work, they can't make do with it. He wants to say this is somehow more sustainable than trying to get more people to eat meat? I'm looking forward to seeing some results on how the carnivore and keto communities fare. If they do well, we need to focus on how and why, and if they don't, the same thing goes. Anywho, thank you for watching, and as always, be having a good day.